The night was cold, and the wind howled through the trees like a ghost searching for a lost soul. David Carter sat alone in his wooden cabin, sipping his black coffee. He liked the silence, the peace that came with living far away from the city. No neighbors, no noise, just him and the wild. But tonight, something felt different. A strange feeling crawled up his spine, like he was being watched. He glanced at the security monitors on his wall. The cameras outside showed only darkness, the trees swaying under the stormy sky. Maybe it was just his imagination. Then, beep, beep. The motion sensor alarm blared, breaking the silence. David's grip on his coffee mug tightened. He put it down and reached for his shotgun. He had lived in this cabin for 5 years, and no one ever came here, especially not at this hour. He moved toward the window and peeked outside. At first, he saw nothing. The rain had started, pouring heavily, making it harder to see. But then, he spotted something. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of his porch, barely visible in the dim light. David's heart pounded. Was it an animal, a lost traveler, or something worse? He slowly unlocked the door, but didn't open it fully. Instead, he raised his shotgun and called out, "Who's there?" The figure took a step forward, and the porch light flickered on, revealing her. David's breath caught in his throat. A woman, but not like any woman he had ever seen before. She was tall, her wet clothes clinging to her slender body. Her skin had a strange, almost glowing tint, shifting between pale blue and silver. Her hair, drenched from the rain, shimmered as if it held tiny stars within. But the most striking thing were her eyes. Large, bright, almost too perfect. Silver irises with a glow that seemed unnatural. The woman shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. She looked weak, like she could collapse at any moment. Her lips trembled before she finally spoke. "Please, shelter. I mean no harm." Her voice wasn't normal. It had an echo, like two voices speaking at once. One soft, one distant. David's instincts screamed danger, but something about her felt different. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping the gun steady. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flickered with something. Fear, desperation. "Lyra," she whispered. "I have nowhere else to go. Please, let me in." David hesitated. Every survival instinct told him to send her away. But the storm was getting worse, and she looked half dead. If she stayed out there, she wouldn't make it till morning. After a long pause, he sighed. "Damn it." "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside. "But one wrong move, and you're out." Lyra nodded weakly and stumbled inside. The moment she crossed the doorway, her legs gave out. David caught her before she hit the floor. Her skin was ice cold, but as his hands touched her arms, he felt a faint vibration, like a low electric hum under her skin. His gut twisted. What the hell was she? He placed her gently on the couch and grabbed a blanket, throwing it over her. She didn't protest, just curled up and closed her eyes. David sat across from her, shotgun still in hand. He wasn't stupid. This woman, if she was even human, was hiding something. And until he found out what, he wasn't letting his guard down. The room fell into silence, except for the rain hammering against the windows. Then, just as David started to relax, something strange happened. The dim light in the cabin flickered, buzzing softly. David frowned. He looked at Lyra. She was still lying on the couch, but her wounds were healing. Right before his eyes, the cuts on her arms began closing on their own, as if time was reversing. Within seconds, the bruises on her skin faded into nothing. David's pulse raced. What the hell did he just let into his house? Lyra slowly opened her eyes. She saw the way David was staring at her and sighed. "I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered. David didn't move. His fingers tightened around the gun. "You better start talking," he said, his voice sharp. "What are you?" Lyra hesitated, looking toward the window. The storm outside raged on, but her expression darkened, as if the real storm was still coming. Finally, she met his gaze. David's grip on the shotgun remained firm as he studied the strange woman on his couch. The storm outside roared, but inside, the tension between them was even louder. Liara sat up slowly, her silver eyes flickering with something unreadable. She glanced at the gun, then back at David. "I understand your fear," she said softly. "But if I meant you harm, I wouldn't have knocked on your door. I would have just walked in." David's jaw tightened. That wasn't exactly comforting. He wasn't a man who scared easily, but this was different. He had spent years in the military, seen things most people couldn't even imagine. But never had he encountered something like this. A woman with glowing skin, eyes like molten silver, and the ability to heal her wounds in seconds. "You still haven't answered my question," David said. "What are you?" Liara's fingers curled around the blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked at him for a long moment, as if debating how much to say. Then she took a slow breath and spoke. "I am not from here," she admitted. David's heart pounded, but he didn't react. "Where are you from?" he asked. Liara hesitated. "Far, very far. A place you wouldn't believe existed." David narrowed his eyes. "Try me." She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "You call it space," she finally said. "But to my kind, it is simply home." David's pulse quickened. "You're saying you're an alien?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. Liara gave a small, tired smile. "I believe that is the word your people use." David exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay composed. An alien, an actual alien, was sitting in his living room, wrapped in one of his blankets. Talking to him like this was just another Tuesday night. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had always been a man who relied on logic, on things he could see and touch. And yet, here was something that defied everything he knew. "All right," he said at last, his voice steady. "Let's say I believe you. What are you doing here? Why my house?" Liara's expression darkened. She looked down, her fingers gripping the fabric of the blanket tightly. "I had no choice," she whispered. "I ran." David frowned. "Ran? From what?" She lifted her gaze, and for the first time, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Fear. Real, bone-deep fear. "They found me," she said, barely above a whisper. "They are coming." David's gut twisted. "Who?" he pressed. But before she could answer, something outside let out a piercing, inhuman shriek. David tensed. His military instincts kicked in as he shot up from his chair and moved toward the window, his shotgun ready. The storm continued to rage, but now, something else was out there. Something worse. Through the sheets of rain, he saw movement. Dark shapes shifting in the trees, their silhouettes unnaturally tall, their eyes glowing faintly in the night. David's grip on the gun tightened. "What the hell are those?" he muttered. Liara stood up behind him. Her expression was grim. "They are the reason I ran," she said. "And if they found me, then they will not leave without a fight." David turned to her. "What do they want?" Liara hesitated, then met his gaze. "Me." David cursed under his breath. This was bad. Really bad. "You brought them to my house." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Liara flinched slightly. "I did not mean to," she said. "I was hoping to hide long enough to recover, but they must have tracked my energy signature. They never stop hunting." David ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. He had fought against men before, terrorists, criminals, people who bled when you shot them. But this was something else entirely. Outside, the creatures moved closer. Their glowing eyes flickered like hungry predators closing in on their prey. David took a deep breath. He didn't know what these things were, but one thing was clear. They weren't here for a friendly visit. He turned to Liara. "How do we fight them?" She swallowed hard. You don't, she said. You run. David shook his head. Not happening. This is my house. I don't run. Lyara's eyes softened. Then you will die. David clenched his jaw. He had survived war zones, ambushes, and near-death situations more times than he could count. He wasn't about to back down now. Not tonight, he said. Then, with one last look at the approaching shadows, he clicked the safety off his shotgun. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. David stood by the window, watching as the dark figures outside drew closer. His mind raced, analyzing the situation in seconds. The creatures had an almost eerie quietness to their movement, but their eyes, those glowing eyes, gave away their position. They were relentless and coming for Lyra. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged with tension. David's grip tightened around his shotgun, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He knew it wasn't enough to stop whatever was out there, but it was the only weapon he had. He turned toward Lyra, who was standing still by the couch, her eyes locked on the window with a haunted expression. "What are they?" David asked, his voice low but urgent. Lyra's eyes flickered to him, and for the briefest moment, he saw something in her gaze, a mixture of pain and guilt. "They are hunters from my home. They track down those who escape, those who defy the rules. They don't stop until they get what they want." David's heart beat faster. "And what do they want from you?" Her silver eyes lowered. "Me." David's mind swirled. "What's so special about you?" She hesitated. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke again. "I'm not like the others of my kind. I was born differently." The sound of something scraping against the cabin door interrupted their conversation. David's body stiffened, and he instinctively stepped toward the door. A chill ran down his spine as he heard the sound of claws scraping against wood. "Get back," he ordered, his voice sharp. Lyra didn't argue. She stepped away from the door, but her eyes never left David. She was watching him closely, waiting for him to act. Outside, the creature's presence was getting stronger, more pronounced. There was something primal about the way they moved, as though they were sensing his every move, tracking his heartbeat through the walls. David turned the deadbolt on the door and checked the windows. He was trapped inside, but the creatures were out there. He had no way of knowing what exactly they were capable of. He glanced back at Lyra. "What can you do? Do you have any weapons? Any powers?" Lyra shook her head, but her expression was fierce. "I cannot fight them. Not like this. They have a power far beyond my own." David's mind spun. The situation was growing dire. If Lyra couldn't help, it was all on him. And from what she'd said, there was no running. These hunters never stopped until they found their prey. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the cabin. The door rattled violently, and the sound of something heavy slamming into it made the walls tremble. David's heart raced. He reached for his phone, but it was useless. The storm had knocked out the cell signal hours ago. And now, the creatures were just outside. A shadow crossed the window. It was too late to hide now. The creatures outside were no longer a distant threat. They were at the door. The cabin felt too small, too fragile for what was about to happen. David turned to Lyra. "You need to get out of here," he said, his voice strained. "I'll hold them off." She shook her head vehemently. "No. If they take you, they will destroy everything. I will not leave you to die." David didn't have time to argue. The door shook again, and this time, the hinges began to groan, the wood splintering with each hit. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't fight them alone, but he wasn't going to just let them take her. David ran toward the back of the cabin, grabbing what little he had in the way of makeshift weapons, a fire poker, a kitchen knife, whatever he could find. His pulse raced, and his breath was short. He was prepared to die if it meant giving Lyra a chance to escape. But then, just as he was about to move toward the door, Lyra stepped in front of him. Her eyes were wide with determination. "You don't have to die," she said urgently. "I can stop them. I just need your help." David paused, uncertainty flashing through him. Help with what? Layara reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "You don't understand. I have abilities, powers, but they are limited. You have something. You have something that can help me amplify it." David's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What do I have?" Layara's eyes flickered to the shotgun in his hand. "That. The energy inside of it. The energy inside of you. It's stronger than you think. Together, we can use it to defend ourselves." David glanced down at the shotgun in his hands, confused. "What are you talking about?" Layara didn't have time to explain further. The door groaned again, and the creature's claws scraped at the wood with a bone-chilling screech. "Please," Layara begged, her voice shaking. "You have to trust me. We can stop them, but we have to act now." David hesitated for only a moment before he nodded. There was no other choice. He stepped forward, placing his hand on hers, and together, they focused on the shotgun. A strange warmth spread from his hand to hers, and then it was like an electrical current passed through them both. The power was sudden, like a spark igniting a flame. It wasn't just the shotgun. It was something deeper, something primal, the energy between them. And in that moment, David felt it. The overwhelming strength, the power, the force that surged through his body, as if it was awakening from some long-forgotten slumber. The creatures outside suddenly stopped. The air felt thick, charged with the crackling of energy. They were close, too close. David and Layara stood together, facing the door. And for the first time, David realized that he wasn't alone. Whatever Layara was, whatever she had given him, it was enough to fight back. The door burst open, and the fight began. The door shattered inward with a deafening crack, the force of the impact sending splinters flying in every direction. The creatures outside, tall and shadowy, with glowing eyes like embers in the darkness, flooded into the room in a blur of motion. Their elongated limbs stretched unnaturally as they moved, their skin a slick iridescent black, reflecting the faint light that managed to creep through the storm. Their mouths, filled with rows of jagged teeth, twisted into grotesque snarls. David didn't hesitate. He swung the shotgun up, the heavy barrel aimed at the first creature that lunged toward him. The blast rang out, deafening and forceful, sending the creature stumbling backward. But it wasn't enough. The creature shook off the blast, as if it were little more than a nuisance, its glowing eyes narrowing, filled with fury. It lunged again, this time faster, and David barely managed to sidestep its razor-sharp claws. His heart raced, the adrenaline surging through his veins, but the fight wasn't over yet. From the corner of his eye, he saw Layara move. Her silver eyes shimmered with an intensity that David couldn't comprehend, but there was no time to question it. She raised her hand, her palm facing the approaching creatures, and an energy pulse shot from her fingers, striking the nearest one with a crackling, brilliant force. The creature screamed in agony as it was blasted backward, its body contorting unnaturally before it crumpled to the floor, motionless. David blinked, his breath caught in his throat. She had done that, without any weapon, without any physical contact. He didn't have time to think about it. The other creatures were advancing, and they were fast. The air around them seemed to pulse with an unnatural heat as they closed in, their movements synchronized, as though they were a single entity with a shared mind. David fired again, his hand shaking, his instincts kicking in. The blast caught another creature in the chest, but it didn't fall. Instead, it shrieked, the sound high-pitched and deafening, and charged forward with even more speed. Layara moved fluidly, her body a blur, as she gestured with both hands. A blast of energy shot out from her, this time stronger and more concentrated, striking the creature square in the chest. The impact sent it crashing into the wall, where it crumpled to the ground, unable to move. David couldn't keep up with the speed of it all. The storm outside raged louder. drowning out most of the sounds of the fight. But the crackling energy and the sickening thuds of the creatures hitting the walls were enough to make his heart race. A third creature appeared from the darkness, this one faster than the others. Its eyes burned with rage as it charged toward Lyra. David's mind screamed for him to act, but it was already too late. Lyra didn't see it coming. Without thinking, he threw himself in front of her. The creature's claws raked across his chest, ripping through his shirt and drawing a line of blood. Pain exploded across his body, but he didn't falter. He slammed the shotgun into the creature's side, pushing it off balance long enough to pull the trigger. The creature howled in fury as the blast hit its side, sending it stumbling back. Lyra was at his side in an instant. Her hand gripped his arm, and a soft, glowing energy washed over him. The burning pain in his chest dulled as the warmth from her touch spread through him. The bleeding slowed. The wound wasn't healing, but the pain, it was manageable now. "Don't move," she said, her voice urgent but calm. David barely registered the words. He was already on the move again, sidestepping another creature that came charging at him, this time slashing at its legs with the butt of his shotgun. The creature shrieked, but before it could retaliate, Lyra sent another wave of energy at it. The blast hit the creature's chest with enough force to send it flying across the room. It didn't move after that. David didn't have time to take a breath. There were still 2 more creatures closing in on them. His hands shook with exhaustion, but he refused to let up. He raised the shotgun again, aiming at the closest one, when Lyra stepped in front of him. "Wait," she said, her eyes scanning the creatures with a sharpness that was almost inhuman. David paused, his grip tightening on his weapon. "What is it?" "They're not like the others," she said, her voice laced with something darker. "They're smarter. They've been trained." David didn't understand at first, but then he saw it. The 2 remaining creatures didn't rush in blindly. Instead, they circled them, keeping their distance. They seemed to be testing their strength, watching for weaknesses. Lyra's eyes flashed. "We have to take them together," she said, her voice cold and determined. David nodded. He didn't have time for hesitation. He and Lyra would have to rely on each other if they were going to survive this. The creatures moved in a blur. The first one attacked David, claws slashing toward his face. He ducked, but it was only a moment before the second one lunged at Lyra. David fired his shotgun, hitting the first creature square in the chest. But it didn't stop. Instead, it howled in pain and charged faster, more vicious than before. Lyra, focused and intense, raised her hands toward the second creature, her eyes glowing. She sent another burst of energy toward it, but this time the creature dodged. It wasn't as simple as before. It was adapting. David cursed under his breath. They were running out of time. "Lyra," he shouted, his voice full of urgency. "We need to end this now." She looked at him, and in that instant, their eyes met, and something passed between them. They both moved at once. David hurled the shotgun toward the first creature, using it as a distraction while he rushed in with a knife from the kitchen. At the same time, Lyra sent another wave of energy toward the second creature. The first creature, distracted by the flying shotgun, hesitated just long enough for David to strike. He plunged the knife into its side, feeling the sharp resistance before it slipped in deep. The creature staggered, but it wasn't dead yet. Lyra's energy blast hit the second creature, sending it tumbling into the wall with a sickening thud. David didn't give up. He twisted the knife, pulling it out and striking again, this time aiming for the creature's head. It collapsed. Only one remained. The storm outside howled louder, but inside, there was only the eerie silence of the final, standing creature. It snarled, its eyes glowing with unrelenting fury. But now, it was alone. David and Lyra were ready. The remaining creature, now realizing it was alone, snarled viciously as it staggered backward, its bloodshot eyes scanning the room for any possible escape. Its massive form was scared and beaten, but it still looked dangerous. Every muscle in its body twitched with intent, preparing for one last, desperate assault. It was cornered now. There was nowhere left to run. David gripped the knife tighter, his palms sweaty. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his mind was sharp, focused. Lyra stood beside him, her energy pulsing through the air, an invisible force that made the room feel alive. The storm outside, once a loud, oppressive presence, had quieted, as though nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Without warning, the creature lunged forward, its claws extended in a deadly arc. David barely managed to dodge, feeling the brush of air as the claws passed by his face. He instinctively swung the knife upward, but the creature twisted midair, avoiding the strike with an almost uncanny grace. Lyra moved with lightning speed, placing herself between David and the creature, her silver eyes glowing brighter with power. She raised both of her hands, and a pulse of energy surged through the room like a thunderclap. The creature howled, recoiling from the blast, but it quickly recovered, its rage fueling it even more. David knew they couldn't keep going like this. This fight had to end soon. He glanced at Lyra, his heart pounding. She was still standing strong, but the fight had clearly drained her. He could see the strain in her posture, the way her body was trembling slightly as she maintained her stance, ready to unleash another wave of energy. It was clear she was giving everything she had left. "Lyra," he said, his voice steady but urgent, "we have to end this. Together." Lyra didn't look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the creature, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I know," she replied quietly. "But this thing, it's not like the others." David didn't need an explanation. He understood that they were facing something far more dangerous, something smarter, something that could adapt. He looked at the creature, its glowing eyes locked onto his with a mixture of intelligence and hate. It had been through a lot, and it wasn't just fighting to survive. It was fighting to win. The creature attacked again, this time with calculated precision. It darted toward David, its claws slashing horizontally, aiming for his torso. David blocked with his knife, using the blade to deflect the blow. The impact sent a shock of pain through his arm, but he didn't let go of the handle. Instead, he spun, using the momentum to slash at the creature's side. It screamed, but it didn't back down. Lyra stepped forward, her hands crackling with energy. This time, she wasn't just releasing a wave of force. She was building something stronger. David felt the change in the air, the pressure increasing as Lyra concentrated. The energy around her seemed to warp and bend, swirling into a massive sphere of light. It hummed with power, brighter than the sun. And for a moment, David could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She was pushing herself beyond her limits. He knew this was their only chance. Without hesitation, David charged the creature, drawing its attention away from Lyra. He dodged another swipe of claws, rolling across the floor and landing on his feet with cat-like agility. The creature snarled in frustration and followed, its massive form closing in on him. He had only one shot at this. Lyra, sensing his movement, flung the energy sphere at the creature with a force that rattled the entire room. The sphere exploded on contact, engulfing the creature in a blinding light. The explosion sent shockwaves through the house, rattling the walls, and shaking the floor beneath their feet. The creature's scream echoed through the room, a final desperate cry as it was consumed by the energy. David shielded his eyes, feeling the heat of the blast even from a distance. The force of it sent him stumbling back, his ears ringing from the intensity of the explosion. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and when the light faded, the creature was gone, nothing but a smoldering crater where it had once stood. Silence. David's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene. The room was still intact, but the air was thick with the scent of burned flesh and ozone. Lyra stood a few feet away, her hands still glowing with residual energy, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. She was exhausted, but there was something else in her expression. Relief, maybe, or a deep sense of satisfaction. David didn't move right away. He wanted to make sure the fight was truly over, but the longer he waited, the more he realized they had won. It was over. Liara slowly turned to face him, her eyes softening as she lowered her hands. She looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something unspoken. David didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded. "I think we both need a moment," he said quietly. Liara offered a faint smile, her lips curling just slightly. "You're right." But there was more to it than that. They had survived. Against all odds, they had made it through the battle. They had fought side by side, and for the first time in a long while, David felt something stir within him, a sense of trust, of camaraderie. They weren't just survivors. They were a team. And for the first time in a long while, David believed that they could face whatever came next. Together, David stood at the center of the quiet room, his heart still racing from the intensity of the battle. He glanced over at Liara, who was leaning against the wall, her energy finally beginning to wane. Her glowing eyes had dimmed, and the faint aura of power around her had started to dissipate. She looked tired, but there was a resilience in her that David admired. Despite the devastating attack they had just survived, there was still a sense of something else hanging in the air, an unresolved tension. David couldn't help but feel that the danger wasn't over yet. Something about the way the creature had acted, its intelligence and unnatural persistence, left him uneasy. "Are we safe?" he asked, his voice low, still cautious. Liara took a deep breath and slowly pushed herself off the wall. Her steps were slow and deliberate as she crossed the room to him, her gaze focused on the now empty space where the creature had been moments ago. Safe, for now. But that creature was more than we realized. She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she thought. Its actions, they were calculated. It wasn't just a mindless monster. There's something else behind this. David felt a chill run down his spine. He had sensed it too. Something more sinister was at play here. The creature wasn't just a random threat. It was part of something larger, something that might come back to haunt them. "We need to find out more," David said, his voice steady, but his mind was already racing. He could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding the full scope of the danger that lurked beyond their small world. Liara nodded, her eyes never leaving the spot where the creature had been. "I know. And I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of these creatures. They were sent for a reason." She looked back at him, her expression serious. This was just a warning. David didn't reply immediately. The words hung in the air, heavy with the implication of what she was suggesting. If this was just a warning, then what was coming next? How much worse could it get? He took a deep breath and forced himself to focus. They needed to prepare for whatever came next, and they needed information, answers. "We'll figure this out," David said, his voice firm. "But first, we need to rest. You're in no condition to keep going right now." He wasn't just concerned about her physical state. He knew that whatever powers Liara had used to fight back against the creature had taken a toll on her. She was strong, but even the strongest beings needed time to recover. Liara didn't argue, but the slight hesitation in her eyes told him she wanted to push forward. She was a warrior at heart, always ready to fight, but she knew he was right. The battle had taken everything out of both of them. For the first time in what felt like forever, David allowed himself to relax. They both needed a break, even if just for a moment. He glanced toward the door of the house, the same door that had once felt like a safe haven, but now felt almost like a trap. The quiet was unsettling. There was no telling what lay beyond the house, and yet for now, it was the only place they could rest. Liara sat down on the couch, her movements slow and deliberate, and David took a seat across from her. Neither of them spoke at first, each of them lost in their own thoughts. It was David who broke the silence after several long moments. "You said you were sent here for a reason. What was that reason? He asked, his curiosity piqued. Lara looked at him, her silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. There was a weight to her words, an underlying sorrow that she hadn't yet shared. "I was sent to protect you," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of resolve and something else, a hint of vulnerability that she rarely allowed to show. David's eyebrows furrowed in surprise. "Me? Why?" Liara shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable. "Because," she began slowly, "you are the key to something much bigger. Something I can't fully explain yet." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "But I know you are more important than you realize. More than I realized." David absorbed her words, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle that was rapidly unfolding around him. He had always considered himself just a regular guy, someone with no special powers or knowledge about anything beyond his own life. But now he was being told that he was somehow the key to something far greater, something that would likely determine the fate of their world. "I don't understand," David said, his voice tinged with confusion. "Why me? What do I have that could be so important?" Lyra looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I can't explain it all yet," she said quietly. "But I know you have a connection to something ancient, something lost to time, and hidden away for a reason. You might not see it, but you have the power to change everything." David stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. What power? What connection? He had no idea what she was talking about, but there was something in her gaze, something that made him feel like his entire world was about to change. "We'll figure this out," he said again, but this time, it didn't feel like just a promise. It felt like a vow. Lara gave him a small, knowing smile. "I believe you." But even as she said the words, there was a quiet tension in her eyes. A warning, perhaps. She knew the path ahead wasn't going to be easy. Whatever was coming, they would need to face it together. David's mind raced as he absorbed everything Lara had told him. The idea that he was connected to something ancient and powerful felt impossible to grasp. For years, he had lived an ordinary life, his days filled with mundane routines, work, and simple pleasures. He never thought he would find himself caught up in something far beyond his comprehension, let alone be the key to something world-altering. He looked at Lara, her silver eyes glinting faintly in the dim light of the room. Despite her weary state, there was an undeniable strength in her presence, an otherworldly aura that emanated from her every time she spoke. It was clear that Lara was more than just a visitor from another planet. She was tied to something much larger than either of them could fathom. "What do you mean, I have a connection to something ancient?" David asked again, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of questions in his head. "How can I be the key to something like that? I'm just me." Lara gave him a soft, sad smile, the kind that spoke of a truth she couldn't quite put into words. She crossed the room and sat beside him, a small distance between them that felt comforting rather than distant. "David," she began, her voice low and deliberate, "you're not just anyone. You have something inside you, a piece of an ancient power that's been dormant for centuries." David shook his head, trying to process the weight of her words. He had never considered himself special, let alone part of some cosmic puzzle. He was just an average man trying to get by in a world that rarely offered anything extraordinary. "Dormant?" he repeated, the word hanging in the air like a mystery he couldn't crack. "What do you mean by dormant?" Lyra's gaze became distant, as though she was seeing something beyond the walls of the room. "Long ago, the universe was filled with beings of immense power," she explained slowly, as though she was unraveling a story buried in the depths of time. These beings were the guardians of ancient knowledge, and they left behind traces of their energy, fragments that still exist in certain individuals. Your lineage carries one of those fragments, David. You are a descendant of one of these guardians, whether you realize it or not. David's head spun. His lineage. Guardians? He had no idea how to even begin understanding the gravity of what Lara was saying, but her tone was serious. She wasn't speaking in riddles or offering him false hope. She was sharing the truth, the kind that could change the entire course of their lives. "So, I'm part of some ancient guardian bloodline?" David asked, trying to keep the incredulity out of his voice. He could almost laugh at how absurd it sounded, but Lyra's steady expression told him this was no joke. "Not just part of it," she corrected gently. "You are one of the last living descendants of the Guardians. That means you have the potential to unlock their power, the power to protect this world, or destroy it, depending on how you choose to wield it." The weight of her words hit David like a sledgehammer. The power to protect, or destroy. What could that even mean for someone like him? He was just trying to survive, trying to keep a low profile in a world that often felt like it was spinning out of control. The idea that he had the fate of the world resting on his shoulders was beyond anything he could imagine. "Why now?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did it take so long for this power to awaken? Why me?" Lyra's eyes softened, her gaze filled with understanding. "It's not about timing, David," she said. "It's about you being ready. The world is on the brink of something catastrophic, and your power, your connection to the Guardians, is the only thing that can stop it." David's pulse quickened. What kind of catastrophe could possibly be so dangerous that only he had the power to stop it? He felt small in that moment, insignificant in the face of such immense responsibility. But then something inside him stirred, a deep primal instinct that told him he could rise to the occasion. Maybe he wasn't just an ordinary man after all. "So, what do I do now?" David asked, his voice firm with resolve. "How do I unlock this power? And how do I stop whatever is coming?" Lyra stood up, her eyes now focused and determined. "That's what we need to figure out. Your power is latent, dormant, but it's there. It will take time to awaken fully, and you'll need guidance. You'll need to train, to understand the depth of what you carry inside you." David nodded slowly, trying to wrap his mind around the idea of training to unlock some hidden power. It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie, but Lyra's sincerity left no room for doubt. He was part of something much bigger than himself. "But where do we start?" he asked. "How do we even begin?" Lyra's gaze turned steely, her tone unwavering. "We find the ancient relics, the artifacts that contain the knowledge and the power of the Guardians. They've been hidden for centuries, lost to time. But I know where some of them are. We'll need to search for them, and once we find them, they will help you unlock your potential." David felt a surge of determination. He didn't know exactly what he was getting himself into, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a purpose. The pieces were falling into place, and despite the uncertainty of the path ahead, he was ready to face whatever came next. "We'll find them," he said, his voice strong. "I won't let the world fall apart. I won't let everything we've fought for be destroyed." Lyra smiled, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "I knew you would say that. The Guardians chose wisely when they chose you, David. Now it's time to live up to that potential." The weight of the journey ahead settled over them, but it was a weight David was ready to carry. The adventure that lay before them was uncertain, dangerous, and filled with unknowns. But one thing was clear: David had found his purpose, and nothing was going to stop him from seeing it through.